Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller. I'm Director of Foreign Affairs, National Security, and National Defense here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Casey Babb here joining us on our program. Casey just recently wrote a great policy brief here for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on some of the challenges currently in the Middle East, and in particular on UNRWA. So before I give it over to you, Casey, at MLI we don't do very long biographies, but you have a distinguished background, and I'll just mention a few of your affiliations. You're now a fellow with the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and also with the Royal United Services Institute in London, RUSI, which is an outfit that is a great outfit, and I've had several good collaborations with. Casey also teaches terrorism and international security at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs here in Ottawa, and is a contributor at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So Casey, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. A pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, let's dive straight into it. And I want to start with your recent piece. And I think a lot of Canadians are obviously grappling with the situation currently in the Middle East and trying to understand and filter through some of the disinformation, some of the poor information that we're finding in some of our different media sources, and also looking at what's really happening on the ground. I think your piece does a really good job of outlining some of this. So I wonder if you can just start off with a little bit of a summary of your piece, and more importantly, what is UNRWA and why should Canadians care about this?
Right. So all good questions. I mean, um, the Coles Notes version is essentially that this organization is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, and it's a UN, of course, run and led organization that was established shortly after World War II, and very shortly after and really in response to the War of Independence in Israel, and it was set up as a mechanism, as a body to help resettle Arab refugees in the region who have since come to be known as Palestinians, and they really had the same marching orders and objectives as they had in other instances throughout the world to resettle refugees and to implement sort of workers programs to ensure that they had the social and economic opportunities needed for them to successfully resettle in host nations that they had been displaced to in one way or another. And when I say displaced, I mean that can be forcible displacement. It can be choosing to leave on their own will. There's a variety of reasons and pathways to displacement that have affected Arabs in that part of the world. But that's essentially what the organization is. And as I argued in the piece, Jonathan, you know, it was a noble organization with a clear cause, a justifiable cause, 75 or so years ago. And in the time since, it has really morphed into something far beyond that. That has really, in a variety of ways, made the situation much worse for Palestinians and Israelis alike.
Well, thanks. I think that's a great overview, and I think a challenge that many Canadians find, whether it's with their Middle East policy or more broadly as they conduct their foreign policy, is I think their expectations and their perceptions on one hand of what many multilateral agencies are intended to do, and as you said, I think start off with a noble intention, noble cause, but then whether it's the sort of machinations of some of the states that decide to have different objectives and different interests, and push these agencies into different frameworks. I think it's important to inform Canadians that not all multilateral bodies are created equal, and some of them have been twisted in different ways. So I guess a question for you, and specifically sticking right now to the multilateral realm, what would be some of the alternatives that you would suggest if we were to disband UNRWA? Is there a mechanism within the United Nations that would be successful, or would it fall into the same pitfalls that we've seen UNRWA fall into? are there other sort of multilateral approaches that we could, or agencies or bodies or NGOs that we could think about that would better deserve our funding and political attention than this agency?
Well, I think, there's a few things, if I can just back up a little bit, a few things to note, and to help people sort of contextualize the the heart of the matter here, and that is that UNRWA hasn't been able to achieve the mission that they set out to do. And that mission was outlined for them and created for them, three quarters of a century ago, and they haven't been able to do that. And that is resettle the refugees, and for a variety of reasons, it has been not just ineffective, but it has made the situation much worse and likely intentionally worse. And what I mean by that is, in 1947, 48, 49, in and around that time frame, there were about 750,000 Arab refugees. Now there are several million, and that is because, unlike any other refugee group in history, to the best of my knowledge, what has happened here is that all of the descendants of those original refugees now get to claim refugee status. And not only does that include um, sort of immediate family members, it's their family members and their family members and their family members. And so, what I mean by that is, if you're born in Toronto, but your grandparents, or maybe in the future, your grandparents' grandparents were displaced in 1948, you then can consider yourself, and we see this all the time, a Palestinian refugee. Even if you adopt children, they are considered Palestinian refugees. And so there's no sort of easy way to say this or to approach this, but it would appear as though there's been a concerted effort over the last 75 years to not only increase the amount of refugees that there are, thereby making the situation a larger situation than it was in the first place. You enable refugees to maintain a forever status of being a refugee. And when you do that, well, what are you doing? You're signaling to them that one day you you will get to no longer be a refugee, and that will happen by what? Well, getting a do-over, probably, of the war that you lost in 1948 and the successive wars that you lost since 1967 and 1973. And so this is just a roundabout way, because I just wanted to come back to that this is, if you allow a group of individuals to, and their families and their families and generation after generation, to maintain refugee status, I mean, you're signaling to them that there's going to be a pathway to you no longer being a refugee, but that's, you have to look back for that, and you don't need to look forward. You get to maintain your refugee status. um, and so, to your question, are there alternatives here? Well, I mean, the bottom line up front is that this agency isn't working. They haven't achieved anything. If anyone can come to me and say, here's what they've achieved, here's who they've helped, um, and this is what they've done for Palestinians and Israelis in terms of improving the situation there, let me know, because I don't know what they've done. And now, of course, they are responsible for, the educational programs in the Palestinian territories. Well, what do those education programs look like? I mean, the individuals who carried out this massacre on October 7th, many of them were graduates of UNRWA educational programs. So, in terms of alternatives, I mean, it's important to note that the Palestinians have their own agency within the UN, and every other refugee group on planet Earth is lumped into another stream of refugee support under the United Nations. So there's something there that's uh, off the mark on something that's not working and hasn't worked in a long time. I don't know what those alternatives would be, but I think what we need to do is unfortunately, stop infantilizing a group of people and pull the Band-Aid off and figure out a different way towards fixing this situation, because the way that it's been going hasn't helped anybody.
Well, I think that's a very clear point and clear description, which is really helpful. And it sort of leads me to pivot to my next sort of question and point of discussion, which would be particularly on for Canadian policy. So I think, as you mentioned in your piece, Canada has now suspended payments, but to UNRWA. But as you suspect, and I think probably many of us suspect, those payments eventually will come back online with some of the allies who've also suspended their payments. So I wanted to ask you a couple questions. First, what's the lay of the land of some of Canada's main allies on how they're approaching issues? I think you did highlight that a little bit in your piece, but it'd be nice to talk about that. And second, what should be the policy for Canada going forward, particularly on this issue, but more broadly as it approaches this the fallout of Hamas's brutal terrorist attack last October?
Right. I mean, so to your first question, if I heard you right, Jonathan, I mean, numerous other allies, Canada's allies, have also, you can call it pulled funding, or I think of it as pausing, temporarily putting a pause on funding. Um, uh, and so I think, as I've said before, this whole region, this whole situation is politically volatile. And politicians want more than anything else to preserve their positions, and to make as few people as possible upset, as few voters as possible upset with their policies. They want to get reelected. This government wants to get reelected. And so, what often happens, and this is akin to, the situation itself in terms of UNRWA, and in terms of not taking action on it, that's really been the approach of most governments over the last 70 years, with the exception of course, attempts to reach peace settlements. But by and large, politicians, governments, they don't want to touch this because it's too volatile. So what they do is they try to exercise some degree of political neutrality rather than being right. They would rather be somewhere in the middle, which is completely wrong and ineffective, than bother certain groups or ruffle the feathers of certain groups. And so it just prolongs the situation. So I mean, that's been the case of Canada, even with the outrageous case of genocide that was brought before the Hague, in terms of, between South Africa and Israel. Canada's approach on that, the government's approach on that, and their language was not only just abysmal, it was confusing. People are saying, "Well, what are you saying? What does that even mean? What side are you on?" And their position really is, we're not on anybody's side. We're just, we're along for the ride. And so I think when other people unpause or unfreeze their funding here, Canada will do the same thing, and they'll probably be at the front of the pack to do that, just because they see it as a way to sort of validate their ideological positions, and it's a safe move. So that's likely what they'll do. I mean, I don't think that this funding will be frozen for too long, and that's our money. Those are our taxpayer dollars. But I don't know how many people really care about that. If they care that their taxpayer dollars are used in pay for slay programs in the Palestinian territories, if their taxpayer dollars end up in the hands of Hamas, so they can build tunnels. Many of those tunnels use child labor. I don't care if I don't know if they care that their taxpayer dollars are used to radicalize generation after generation of Palestinians in the classroom. I mean, they might just care mostly about, the cost of living here in Canada, the price of gas, the cost of groceries, and so on and so forth. But Canadians need to realize that your tax dollars are going towards this, and they're going towards your money is finding its way into the pockets of the leaders of Hamas. So, um, alternatives, well, I don't know what the alternatives are, but it's not working, and I would expect the taps to be turned back on any time now, uh, particularly with Israel sort of moving towards an operation of sorts, the next phase of their campaign in Rafah. Um, everybody's going to be their attention will be drawn towards what's inevitably going to be a serious humanitarian issue there, and that will only lead to further calls to get the money flowing again.
Well, I think that's a really good point, and I think your point on the ICJ ambiguity or wavering or dithering, I think is a really good one, and it strikes me as an episode that's not unique just to the Middle East. I think it's been more symbolic, frankly, of Canada's foreign policy for several years, but I think it's been particularly acute in the past 10 years. And it goes like this: that Canada can be friends to all people on all issues, that we can share interests with everyone, and we can just sort of take this neutral party status. But I think, as we know, and I think as many Canadians know, we share certain interests, defined interests, even though we don't articulate them. We have certain value sets that we share with allies and partners, and I think it's about time that we start very seriously thinking about which institutions and which partners share those, and how we can promote them. So I think this is a clear example of this, where Canada wants to come out in foreign policy terms as not upsetting anyone, not upsetting any apple carts.
That's right.
But in the end of the day, they end up upsetting everyone because they don't clearly define their position. So I want to use that as a hinge to my last point, and I think it's a bigger strategic point. But with everything we're talking about today, with UNRWA, with obviously the fallout of what happened last October, I think it's more symbolic of the bigger question of Canada's strategic interests globally. But in particular, to zoom in a bit on the Middle East, we've seen developments shifting. I mean, this region is dynamic and evolving, as many parts of the world are, and has been shifting for years before the brutal attack last October. Do you feel, as many, as personally I do, and many of my colleagues do, that Canada has been very slow to adapt to the realities of what's shifting in the Middle East, whether it's the Abraham Accords, whether it's some of the different perspectives and challenges that are happening right now? Do you feel that Canada is behind on this? And if so, what are some steps that Canada should take to chart out a more pragmatic, realistic strategy in this part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, you raise a number of great points, Jonathan. This government has not. I'm not sure anybody knows really what their foreign policy objectives are, and in the Middle East, it's become clear that this is beyond their grasp, beyond their understanding. They're really nowhere to be found, and I think this is, reflected in multilateral efforts, and political high level political conversations that aren't including Canada. And we see this in the Middle East, but we see this with other sort of theaters as well. Um, and frankly, I don't know. I wouldn't hold my breath that this government's really going to be able to turn anything around. I think they are probably seized with other issues, and as you noted, they try to make everybody happy on every issue, and by doing that, they make very few people happy. I, you know, I think like other governments, though, they need to come to terms with several things when it comes to the Middle East, and this isn't just, I feel like when people use the phrase "peace in the Middle East." They're really talking about Israel, but, sort of geopolitical issues, humanitarian crises, volatile areas, corruption. There are so many issues that go far beyond Israel. I mean, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or Iran or Yemen or Iraq or Syria, but i- you know, so they need to find a way to um, insert themselves in a substantive manner to help move the needle in areas which we could, which fall into our strengths. In the When it comes to Israel and you know uh, issues between Israelis and Palestinians, they need to get real. They need to realize that whatever they've been doing hasn't been working. Um, that trying to appease both sides equally isn't working. Um, I think they need to. probably, and to go back to what we were originally talking about, UNRWA, they need to cease funding for that permanently, and use those tens of millions of dollars in another way to improve the situation and to improve the lives of Palestinians, which they deserve. None of what I'm saying negates the fact that there are, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people living in Gaza and the West Bank that deserve a better future. But this government can't continue to infantilize a people, and at the same time not hold certain groups of people accountable at all, while also signaling that those same groups of people have what it takes to have their own country and have their own military. How can a group of people that have the world has never demanded any accountability of them be expected to govern themselves, be expected to um, um, act responsibly in any substantive way in the region? I don't understand what the approach of this government and other governments is when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East, specifically between Israel and the Palestinians. Um, and the other dynamic here is that a lot of these issues, and really at the heart of what we're talking about here, they are they're uncomfortable, so people would rather not talk about them. And people would rather not talk about the fact that um, you really need to de-radicalize uh, a generation or generations of Palestinians who don't believe that they can have a peaceful coexistence next to a Jewish state. We need to start talking about these things. We talk in such a way that we just assume that they are going to embrace our plans that we push on them, and that everything will be better if we just pursue a two-state solution. No one's Very few people in this government and most other governments are talking about the fact that there's no real interest in a two-state solution, in my opinion. I mean, look at the data, look at the polls that have come out that have been carried out in the West Bank since October 7th. There are a lot of people in the West Bank and Gaza who want their own state, but they want their state instead of a Jewish state. They don't want to be next to a Jewish state. And that is part of the issue. And so we can't keep trying to have our cake and eat it too. It's not working. And I think some government, some group of politics, they're going to have to stand up and be the ones to um, take a more realistic stance on these things, because we just keep dancing around the same issue decade after decade, and it's not working. So, I mean, to circle back to your questions, I think they need to really wake up to the realities on the ground. They need to strengthen their expertise and their understanding of the Middle East. Um, and they need to start having conversations with the right people, and that's something that I don't think they've been doing for a very long time.
Well, thanks very much, Casey. I think we're going to unfortunately have to leave it there for today, but I know that this discussion is going to keep going on. Again, we really appreciate your contribution, and I know that we're going to have you back for round two and perhaps round three on this discussion. Dr. Casey Babb, thank you so much for joining the podcast, and we'll talk to you soon. And thanks to all of our viewers for watching.
Thanks, Jonathan.